During the treatment phase of your cancer journey, AYA patients' social lives often take a large hit. Feelings of isolation, sadness, and loneliness can have negative impacts on your mental health, as well as your treatment. In this episode of Come On In, AYA Cancer Unfiltered, we consider the importance of mental health, community, and staying connected in treatment, the social impact of cancer. It can feel daunting deciding who to tell about your cancer. There may be little time to sit down and talk about a recent cancer diagnosis during the diagnosis phase, but treatment can be harder to hide from friends and family, and patients shouldn't have to hide. Feelings of embarrassment and social anxiety prevent many people from really connecting to those around them during cancer treatment. We asked Dr. Leonard Sender, a hematologist and oncologist and the founder of the Society for Adolescent and Young Adult Oncology, to answer the question, who should I tell about my cancer?
I suggest tell the world, tell your friends, tell your family. There's nothing worse than a cancer patient feeling alone. And I would also seek out people who have been through AYA cancer before. What did they learn? What can they share that will help you? Reach out to organizations that will have the information. That's why they're there.
We've mentioned support groups a lot, and that's for a good reason. Many patients feel isolated, lonely, or depressed during the treatment phase. Often, they may only interact with their care team and family through the day, and symptoms may prevent them from spending quality time with the people they love. That's where support groups can help AYAs, their caregivers, and their families socially connect to others in similar situations and gain insight from previous AYA cancer patients. To talk a bit about peer-to-peer support and socializing during the treatment phase, we have Lauren Creel and Mallory Casperson of Cactus Cancer here with us. Welcome back to the show. When should someone seek out a support group during the treatment phase? So what are the benefits of peer-to-peer support?
To answer your question of when people should seek that out, I think really some people might need to seek that out right away and have a formal support group the entire time. Some people might not be interested in that at all, and that's totally okay. There's so many different types of support available. Like, for example, this podcast is a form of support, and it's one where you don't have to interact with anybody else when you're listening to it, and that might be the right fit for people. So I think really just to figure out what is appealing to you as a patient, what type of support is interesting to you, and what you feel like would be a good match for you.
I think too, to add on to that, we also see a lot of people who go through treatment and sort of a whole year and then hit that first year milestone and realize that there's so much that they're still processing that they haven't figured out how to process on their own. And so we see a lot of people at about the 1 year mark who finally find us and start interacting with the community in a variety of ways.
A lot of times during treatment, like Mallory said, it's very scheduled. So for me, I had 3 times a week I was going to the cancer center, for treatment, for meeting with my oncologist, for getting labs drawn. It was very like, okay, I got to check off the boxes of going to these different appointments. I'm going to have 4 months of this. So I kind of just put my head down and tried to get through it. And I think that's really common for people. They just, okay, I got to get through these steps. And then it's really afterwards when everything settles down that those emotions start to bubble up and people start to realize, oh, that was kind of traumatic and maybe I do need some support.
Yeah, I think too, when we're talking about a diagnosis that is expected to be cured, there's a lot of narrative that's provided to us as patients that as soon as you get through this, it will be done and you will be finished. And that's just not true. There's a patient listening that's like, no, that was true for me, then awesome. I've never heard someone describe it that way. So, and then when we're talking about a diagnosis that isn't expected to be cured, there's just a lot going on all the time. And so I think once we get past this narrative of like, once we're done with the final dose, we're done, and think about the rest of the person and how much support they need around, like Lauren said, this very traumatic thing that is happening. I think that's when support groups of all types are just so important. And so some people come to that realization at different times.
Who can get help from Cactus Cancer?
We focus on the young adult age group, but we push it a little bit. So we welcome in people who are 18 to 45 years old, and are dealing with cancer either as a patient survivor or caregiver. We sort of lump patient and survivor together, but not everyone likes that terminology. So it's separate. And yeah, any diagnosis, any geographic location, all of our programs are online. And so really, as long as you have an internet connection, you can attend programs.
What about feelings of isolation and loneliness? Why do patients develop those feelings in the first place?
Isolation is a very normal feeling for young adults to have, but but everyone is feeling isolated, and so everyone is feeling like they're the only ones in the world who is feeling this way. And if you haven't met another person going through young adult cancer or who has gone through something very life-threatening and traumatic, then that isolation is really built around this idea that your healthy, so to speak, peers around you don't know what's happening to you. There's now really good data in the literature that says that there are lots of quality of life concerns that that are impacted by these feelings of isolation. And so it was important to us really from the get-go that if we design programs, that be one of the things that they help counteract.
Yeah, and Mallory talked about isolation from the aspect of, the other people my age don't really know what I'm going through. But there's another element of isolation that comes from having cancer as a young adult, in that when I look at other cancer patients, they don't really know what I'm going through because they're in their 70s and 80s. So I think it's really important for cancer centers, for hospitals, for medical teams to acknowledge that piece of it as well, and to really do their part in introducing those young adults to organizations that really serve this community so they can meet other people their age going through cancer.
And I think some of this was put on hold a little bit during the pandemic, but there's so many life milestones that a young adult is sort of expecting of themselves based on the society that we live in, to find a career and be able to pay your own rent, like Lauren was talking about, and to find a partner and maybe get married and to have children. And all of those things are impacted by a cancer diagnosis, sometimes very negatively. And seeing all of your non-cancer peers, accomplishing those things, and you literally having your life put on hold for months at a time, is a really, really awful thing to go through.
How do you take care of yourself during the treatment phase?
So my first diagnosis is sort of a blur. I don't think I took very good care of myself. My mom had just died, and so things just like are this like hazy thing that I barely remember. But the second time is far more recent, and I have very clear memories of it. Is just for me, the most important part of taking care of myself was advocating for myself. I experienced treatment much differently the second time around than I did the first, even though I literally was given the same chemo agents. And I had a lot of pain, for instance. And so my care team treated the first time around with steroids. And I just could see that next infusion of chemo coming on the horizon, and the like 4 days of really excruciating bone pain that I was in. Afterwards, I couldn't work during that time. I basically just laid on the couch for 4 days. And so I talked with a friend of mine who's an oncology nurse, and she was like, you could ask your team whether or not some CBD gummies or some cannabis is something that you can try. And this is not possible with all diagnoses. If you're still having trouble and something's not working, I mean, my nurse practitioner, who is sort of the sidekick person to my oncologist, and who I saw a lot as well during treatment, like literally looked me in the face and said, I wouldn't have expected you to have so much bone pain, so I'm not really sure what might work best. And that, for a cancer patient, for me, was so invalidating. I was like, oh my gosh, my brain is just playing tricks on me, which is like ridiculous. But so getting past that, just this idea that like, well, okay, she doesn't really understand it. That's fine. My next step is getting these steroids, but those aren't really doing it. So like, maybe I can get a little creative and ask my care team if that would be okay. And so just this idea that like we are an active part of our care team, and we get to say if something's not going well.
Yeah, I think for me, I knew that the medical side was being taken care of by the professionals. And not to counteract what Mallory's saying, I think advocating for yourself is totally important. But really, for me, I think it was the mental piece that needed the most care. I knew that I was going to have 4 months of treatment, and it was very painful. And a lot of times I would think, oh my gosh, I can't do this for 3.5 more months. But had to just tell myself, well, can I do it for 1 more hour? Yes. Can I sometimes even like, can I do it for 30 more minutes? Yes. And just taking it really like the next step at a time. That was super, super helpful for me.
How can caregivers and family members help a patient who is struggling?
We hear different stories from other people. Like I had a really close friend who I didn't ask him to do this, but it ended up being so life-giving for me. Every time I had a chemo appointment, he must have had a calendar appointment in his own to remind him. But every time I was in the chemo chair, I'd get a playlist texted to me. And so I could like listen to that playlist. And a lot of times it was something I hadn't really spent time listening to. And it was just really, it was very distracting. It was something I looked forward to. It was very fun. So we hear other stories of like, you know, people kept checking in with someone, and it's just how many times can you answer the question, how are you doing, when just every other day or every 2 weeks or whatever your schedule is, you're going in for more treatment. And so asking instead to be sent a $10 gift card for the coffee shop downstairs, or
Well, and I think it's helpful too if someone wants to help to come with maybe 5 things that they could do and ask. Because if you're just asked, how can I help you? It's like, I don't know. I'm overwhelmed thinking about all this other stuff, and it's just something else on my plate to have to think about how people can help. So maybe coming and saying, would it be helpful if I bought you dinner or did your laundry or took your kids to the park, and just, offering some ideas and saying you're willing to help in those ways.
We hear a lot about caring for the caregiver. How can caregivers and family members help themselves during this challenging time?
$1 million question for how to best support caregivers. Because they are a piece of this group that's so hard to capture because they're so busy caregiving, and so often the idea of taking care of themselves is this very foreign notion that's pushed off to the side a little bit. But from my own caregiving experience, I think it's similar. I think you to your question earlier about whether or not it was normal to feel so isolated as a young adult, you don't know what normal is until you talk. Just in general, one doesn't know what normal is until you talk to someone who's going through something similar, and they say, oh gosh, no, that's totally happening to me too. And then so many things happen within our bodies. We feel validated, and we don't feel as alone, and we feel like maybe because whatever is happening is not my fault, so to speak, then maybe I can search out a resource in order to help me with it. And so there are so many things that are positively impacted by just talking to someone else who has gone through this thing that we've gone through. And I think that's the same for patients as it is for caregivers, because there really are a slightly different set of issues there. We try to host programs that are specific for caregivers periodically, because sometimes it's easier to express something that's going on that's difficult without their patient in the room with them. But I think a lot of if one can't find a caregiver only space, I think a lot of the concerns and issues are very similar. And so just connecting with people who have gone through cancer as a young adult is so helpful.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is convincing them that they need to have support, and that it's okay to have self-care for yourself, even though you're, taking on this role of caring for someone else. And I think that's the beauty of a lot of our programs. They're focused on creative expression, creative coping. So it might not necessarily be talking about the nitty-gritty details of your cancer experience, or, what kind of treatment you're on, or any of those things, but it's more about like, I'm feeling stressed out, and let me take the opportunity to journal about that and help, kind of process through my emotions. Those things are just as valuable for cancer patients, survivors, caregivers, people who've never had cancer or have nothing to do with it. I mean, I think that, yeah, creative expression is just one really good way to take care of yourself and your mental health, your emotional health.
What does it mean to adjust to a new normal?
I think people are going to come at this from different ways. Like I trained for marathons and ran marathons before my first diagnosis. And so when I'm sitting in a chemo chair and a nurse is telling me that I like should really maintain some level of physical activity, I had no idea what that meant because I couldn't go out and run 6 miles. And so like what did physical activity mean? And so part of my new normal was not only learning that during cancer treatment, then like learning what that meant for my body later, especially after a second diagnosis and whatever damage had been done to my lungs. And so that was sort of a process in and of itself. I feel like new normal is also just new energy levels. I was a machine before I was diagnosed the first time. I could long distance drive, stay up to go to a party, or stay up cranking, like studying for an exam any time of day or night before being diagnosed. And then all of a sudden I needed like at least 8 hours of sleep, or I felt like a melty mess the next day. For me, learning and adjusting to a new normal first meant that I had to understand that I wasn't like I wasn't doing anything wrong. This was just my body needing new things because it had gone through this big experience.
Yeah, for me, I grew up in California, and then I went to college in Oregon, and then I moved to Atlanta. And that's where I was diagnosed. And so, like I mentioned before, I had just started my first full-time job and was paying my own rent and, finally self-sufficient. And it was never my goal to move back in with my parents in my 20s. But I did. I had to move back to California. And at that point, I hadn't lived there for 6 years. And so most of my friends who I still kept in contact with from San Diego had also moved away. So not only was I, moving back in with my parents and no longer having a job, and I was no longer having a community really either. So for me, a lot of accepting that new normal was like honestly grieving. I think people don't give themselves the opportunity to grieve that, what I had envisioned for my life or for my 20s is completely different. And then from there, moving forward, and really saying, okay, this is not what I planned, but now that this has happened to me, what do I want for my future?
Thank you. These resources are vitally important to help adjustment. In the world of cancer, this is called the new normal. It's the concept that although your life has inevitably changed, there's nothing wrong with what is normal for you right now. To provide some guidance on adjusting to a new life, we've asked Ginny Erickel, an expert in the field, to join us. She's been through cancer twice and now works as an oncology social worker. Welcome back, Ginny. What helped you find your new normal during cancer treatment? Was it difficult to adjust?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when the dust settles, it's, it is. And then also you are like, every personality is different. I went to college and did chemo at the same time. And that really helped me because my doctor said, why don't you go to school? And I was like, I can't go to school. Like, what are you talking about? And I was emotionally, I was getting depressed. And he's like, you can do this, because he knew my personality. And that's another attribute to the medical team and to the social worker, right? Is if you know this person can really handle chemo and college, it was the best thing that he provided for me, mentally and emotionally. And that alleviated that isolation. I brought people into my world and I no longer was feeling isolated. Every personality is different. Some people just they're embarrassed to go outside. I think cancer has really changed and has brought an empowerment to, if you're bald and you're walking out on the street and you're a cancer patient, people are like, good for you. That's so awesome. And I think that humbles a lot of people's minds, I feel, and also allows one who is isolated or feels isolated to say, oh, you know what, maybe I can do what she is doing. Maybe I can rock the bald head.
How did being an amputee affect your finding your new normal?
When I knew that I was going to get amputated, and I was at the Mayo Clinic, I asked to see my leg after it was amputated. And people thought I was crazy. But for me, it was almost like closure for me. Like I wanted to see, and I wanted to be a doctor when I was a kid. What Indian kid doesn't want to be a doctor? And I was like, God, I really want to know, like, where's this bone? I want to see what the bone looks like. And I actually have pictures of my bone because I asked for those photos to see what it was, what it looked like. And that really helped me find closure in the beginning. Okay. If you talk about an amputee, and then I had a really good team that got me into a prosthesis immediately. After my amputation, they literally didn't wait. We got into a leg, I walked, and I was able to do all the things that I wanted to do. It looked different. It looked different. I saw that I can do everything that a normal person, a normal two-legged person can do. I did go to a camp called Dream Street that for the very first time I saw what I thought was skipping, and it did not look like skipping. What I saw in my head was just normally how you skip. But when I saw it in the mirror, it hit me really hard. And that visual for me was really, really difficult. So for a long period of time as an amputee, I avoided mirrors. It took a lot of time to accept my body with the fact that I didn't have a leg. Body image is one of the biggest things that I feel we as amputees deal with.
Thank you. To conclude this episode, we've asked our guests Lauren Creel, Mallory Casperson, and Janie Erikel to answer the question, what is the most beneficial life adjustment you made when you were an AYA cancer patient?
I had no calm hobbies before cancer. And so one of the things that I did that produced a huge shift was telling my dad that for my birthday, I wanted a sewing machine because I also had like no money. Like I don't even remember how much the sewing machine cost, but let's say $100. I couldn't buy it for myself. And so my dad bought me a sewing machine and I used YouTube videos to teach myself to sew. And so like literally just acknowledging that I needed a hobby that I could do while seated that wasn't just consuming television or movies was a huge shift for me.
So when I was diagnosed, I had actually been accepted into a graduate school program that I was supposed to attend the next fall. And I think a big shift that I took was completely changing what I was going to go to school for. I was going to get my master's in peace and justice studies and decided instead I'm going to try and help other cancer patients. So I shifted to social work and public health. And I think that was really meaningful for me as a way to kind of say, okay, this horrible thing happened in my life, and how can I use that for good and for helping other people in the future?
Most important life adjustment, going with the flow. Living in the moment. Really staying present because I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring me. And to live life to the fullest. Try new things. You never know what it could bring you.
That's the end of this episode, and thanks for joining us. Next time, we move on from treatment and into the healing and well-being phase. Tune in to Healing and Well-Being, Your New Normal, for more information. Feeling isolated is normal. Feeling lost is normal. This new normal that you find yourself in may not feel comfortable, but leaning on your community and those that love you can help that feel just a little bit better. See you next time. This has been Come On In, AYA Cancer Unfiltered, a podcast for patients 15 to 39. This podcast was produced by Reimagine Well with funding by 70K. Our creative producer is Emma Grace Eisenman with video production by Sedona Cruz. Our creative director is Roger Holzberg. Our content supervisor is Adele Sender. Our project manager and coordinator is Pamela Primessa Karstens. Our social media manager is Sedona Cruz. Our social media intern is Ryan Meglino. Script by Emma Grace Eisenman, based on the Adolescents and Young Adult Cancer and Oncofertility Guides by Reimagine Well. Audio editing by Emma Grace Eisenman. Video editing by Sedona Cruz. Additional audio and video editing by Graham Karstens. Digital artwork by Ray Jameson. Graphic design by Sarah Gray. A big thank you to our medical experts, Dr. Leonard Sender, Dr. Lakshmi Kondapalli, Jocelyn Harrison, RDN, Ginny Urikel, MSW, and Debbie Wagers, CCLS. Our guests for this episode were Johnny Immerman of Closed Talk and founder of Immerman Angels, Mallory Casperson, MS, co-founder and CEO of Cactus Cancer Society, Lauren Creel, MSW, MPH Chief Operations Officer of Cactus Cancer Society, David Craig, CEO of Grit Health, and Lauren Lustauskas, Vice President of Community at Grit Health. Stephen Giolarakis, President of the Stephen G. Cancer Foundation, Angela Giolarakis, PhD, founder of the Stephen G. Cancer Foundation, and Blake Dirksen. Thank you. This podcast is possible because of you. I've been your host, Marie Sad, and thank you for listening.